I am Sir Dystic. I don't recall how long I've been a member of the Cult of the Dead Cow, but it's been 27 years. I went to DEF CON 3 kind of on a whim. I didn't even really consider myself a hacker at that point, although everybody in my life did, because that was back when people didn't really understand computers. Computers were still more of a hobby than something everybody owned. And I went to DEF CON 3 and met some of the Cult of the Dead Cow people and started hanging out with them socially. A couple lived in San Francisco, or the Bay Area, where I lived. And I was told that I was a member of the Cult of the Dead Cow a couple of years later, and we were off and running, I suppose. The Cult of the Dead Cow is largely a publishing organization that allows people to have their projects amplified via the media channels that Cult of the Dead Cow has spent decades establishing. Back Orifice was the first actual tool that was released by the Cult of the Dead Cow. Previous to that, it had largely been just information. Cult of the Dead Cow was originally a text file group. Pre-internet, files were disseminated largely through bulletin board systems, people dialing up from their home computer to somebody else's home computer and uploading and downloading files via that mechanism. But I proposed the idea of publishing Back Orifice. I had already basically written the tool. There's a lot of different stories about the origins. I wasn't asked by the Cult of the Dead Cow to write Back Orifice. I had written Back Orifice and thought it would be amusing, I suppose, and useful to release it to the public. I had previously written a text file about, title was Who's Gonna Get Screwed Today? This is back when Microsoft's advertising marketing campaign used the term, where do you want to go today? I spent quite a bit of time. This was in like 96 or 97, I think. So Windows 95 came with what they called share level access control, which is, instead of there being user accounts that you had to grant access to, you simply protected a share with a password. There was no security requirements on that password. I knew you could connect from one computer to another across your home network. Microsoft designed that in, and part of Microsoft's problems with security is that they wanted their software to be out of the box as connective and capable as possible. But of course, with every service that's exposed, you are opening up a potential security issue. I spent a lot of time researching, and this was in the days when the World Wide Web was in its infancy and you couldn't just Google things and find the answer. Google didn't even exist at that point. It was Alta Vista and Yahoo, and the search engines were pretty clunky back then. So I spent a fair amount of time trying to figure out how to connect from one computer to another across the internet. I knew it was possible, or I intuited it was possible, but there were several steps that you had to take, none of which were really just like properly documented. Once I figured out the process, which basically involved using a tool that came with Windows 95 called NBTstat, you could use that to remotely query the machine names, well, all of the names that a machine had registered. You could use that across the internet. It was a UDP protocol. I later wrote my own handler for that protocol called NBName, which allowed you to do lots of manipulations of that protocol because it wasn't really designed to be on the internet. It was designed for home networks. So once I figured that out, you basically had to get the remote host name, which was one of the names that a computer registers, obviously, and then you had to add that host name and the IP address to a file in your System32 directory called lmhosts, and then you could access that machine by name as if it was on your local network. And what I quickly discovered was that most people who had a home network had not intuited that those shares were accessible across the internet. And because they wanted to be able to connect to their computers at home, they had shared their entire hard drive with no password. Keeping in mind that this is back in the dial-up days where people were using AOL or small ISPs and their phone line to connect to the internet. So after I published the text file on how to access shares, one of the things I mentioned in that text file was, well, I mentioned a lot of things that this could be used for. and I kind of explained how the file structure of Windows 95 worked, and pointed out that if the C drive was shared, you have access to their startup folder. And if you have access to their startup folder, you can run any program you want on their computer simply by leaving a executable in their startup folder, and then the next time they reboot, it gets executed. And of course, back then, Windows was also vulnerable to something called the ping of death, where if you sent a ping over a certain size, it would just crash the machine. So it was, it occurred to me that it was very easy to install software you wanted on a remote machine if they had their C drive shared, which turned out to be a lot of people. So then it was a question of, well, what kind of thing would you want to have running on somebody else's computer? So the initial back orifice, all it was it simply responded to the back orifice ping packets, and this was useful for relocating a machine that you had previously discovered you had access to, because again, this was back in the dial-up days where people's IP address would change every time they reconnected over the phone to their ISP. But once I had software of my design running on somebody else's computer, I simply went through everything I could think of and implemented it. A lot of it was actually me learning about how to do Windows programming, and I simply kept thinking of more things to add. Obviously file and registry access, screen grabs, keyboard logging. These were all just kind of the logical, extension of, if I have my software running on somebody else's computer without them knowing, what would I want to be able to do with it? Orifice used UDP ports instead of TCP for the obvious reason that when you do a netstat, TCP connections will show the remote IP address that of the person who is connected to it. UDP does not, so it was an intentional choice to use UDP so that people would not be able to identify who was controlling their computer. Using UDP also allowed for essentially blasting packets out across a large group of IP addresses. You could specify a start IP address and an end IP address, and it would simply send a ping packet to every one of those addresses, and you would see who responded, and those would be machines that had back orifice installed on them. As for encryption, this was back when the government was still classifying encryption as weapons. And I was very wary of stepping into that field. So the encryption that the original back orifice used was actually pretty, it wasn't real encryption. The encryption algorithm was essentially the password was hashed into a 16-byte value that I used to seed RAND, the random number generator in C, which will produce a predictable sequence of pseudo-random numbers based on a given seed value. And then each byte in the packet was then XORed with the next call to RAND. So it was obfuscated, but not truly encrypted. Back Orifice 2000 had true encryption, and we consulted with lawyers about that and had issues with how it was distributed because it was at the time not legal to export high encryption. Back in the 90s, in the hacker scene, there was a way of communicating, mostly on IRC, uh, that was called leet speak. I actually even recently saw that as an answer in Jeopardy, and it involved, replacing numbers with letters and whatnot. The a lot of much as how a lot of gangsters decided how to present themselves based on the Godfather movies. A lot of hackers modeled themselves after the movie Hackers, which also used leet speak. And they actually, for that movie, they hired some of the Masters of Destruction crew, the MOD crew, as consultants, and they trained or they told them that this was how hackers communicated. I suspect that may have been somewhat of a joke, but it's one of those self-perpetuating things where once it was in a movie, then that kind of became how people spoke. So elite and elite were not new when Back Orifice came out, and certainly replacing letters with numbers wasn't new. But I did think it would be a funny inside hacker joke to use port 31337 to spell elite. The One of the funny things about Back Orifice was that you could configure which port it actually ran on. It defaulted to port 31337, but you could configure it to use other ports. I think the way most people used it, they didn't configure anything; they just sent it out and uh, scanned for that port, which made it kind of a free for all because it meant that people weren't deploying back Orifice in such a way that they were the sole people who had access to it. You could configure a password as well, but people didn't seem to do that. What this meant was that you could download the back Orifice client and just start scanning IP addresses and find machines that were already infected with back Orifice without having to infect them yourself. The original back orifice hid itself from in the task view or I guess it was called a task view or a process list. I haven't used Windows 95 in so long I don't remember. But it would normally show the executable name, and so it occurred to me that if the executable name was just spaces, it would appear as a blank line in that list. So the uh, back orifice installed itself uh, using into the system32 directory using the name space.exe, which if you look at it with dir, it shows up as exe tilde 1, so it doesn't even look like an executable. And by doing that, it simply showed up as an empty line in the task list. So that's how it was unidentifiable in the list of running processes in Windows 95. At DEF CON 5, we invited the media, sent out press releases that we were going to be releasing Back Orifice, and basically gave Microsoft a chance to respond, even though there was really nothing they could fix to solve this. It wasn't an exploit. And so the Cult of the Dead Cow traditionally does presentations at DEF CON, but this was the first product release. So none of it was really scripted. I had in my head what I wanted to do to present the software. We had two laptops with two projectors, one with the back orifice client, and then the other that I installed back orifice on. That was largely to show that pretty much nothing is visible on the target computer when back orifice is running in the background, except of course for the dialog box, which there's no legitimate purpose, hacking wise, to pop up other than to disturb the user. There may have been plants in the audience. I don't really recall a whole lot of that. I do remember somebody in the Q&A asking about open source and the encryption mechanism that it used, and they were shouted down by other people on the stage saying, "You don't have to use this if you're concerned about that kind of thing." The person who caught the first CD that was thrown out was not a plant. He legitimately took the CD and immediately put it into his computer, and then raised his hand and said he couldn't find it. And I pointed out that he had inserted an auto run CD on his computer, and it was probably there now. He just needed to look for it. But I don't think there was any actual legitimate hecklers during the presentation. It was very well received, and when I did things like open up a remote shell on a Windows 95 computer, which nobody had ever seen before, people seemed very excited. All of the features of Back Orifice were pretty much things that just I did not look at any other software. I was actually unaware that there was other software like this out there. After we released it, people accused us of stealing the idea from. There was one called Sub Seven, I think, and there was one other one. But I simply was unaware that they even existed when I wrote this. Most of the security research that I do, and again, back in the mid 90s, it wasn't like you could just Google these things and find answers. I tended not to even check to see if other people had already done the research because I learned by doing it myself. I learn how protocols work by writing my own handlers for them. The password enumeration functionality is kind of an odd story, actually. I got an anonymous email from somebody one day, and this is before Back Orifice had even been announced. I have no idea who this person was, but they emailed me info about an undocumented API that was called WNet enum cached passwords. And you had to dynamically link to it, I think. And I think that was also the one reason that Back Orifice wouldn't run on Windows NT was because that was a Windows 95 specific API. But that API would enumerate the dial-up passwords, and I think there was a couple of other things that stored their passwords there. It would enumerate them in plain text. So I added that functionality to it after some anonymous person informed me of its existence. It's hard to estimate how widespread the use of back orifice was. We didn't really collect any data ourselves. I wouldn't listen much to ISPs who make reports of such things because they anything they say publicly is simply for PR. It's not usually doesn't really contain a ton of truth. Um, Uh, I certainly received lots of emails from people who told me about how they were using it. Some of them were using it for completely legitimate reasons. A few people thanked me for a free tool that allowed them to fix their sister or their mother's computer from across town without having to drive over there. I knew, people in internet cafes who were using it to control and monitor the computers on their network. But I would also get emails from people who would talk about playing pranks on all of the people in their dorm using Back Orifice, crashing, all of their computers at once, or whatever. Back Orifice was not a remote desktop tool. It was an remote administration toolkit, which later, has been branded as rat tools. It did, however, give you access to everything that you could do from a local computer. And if you're like me, doing things through the desktop GUI, especially in Windows 95, feels pretty clunky anyway. I tend to do everything from the command line. There was a plugin made for Back Orifice. I think Dildog wrote it actually. That did allow a remote desktop. So it did have that functionality, but not implemented by me, but implemented as a add-on, which we called butt plugs, the Back Orifice utility and tool transport. Releasing back orifice was not illegal. Writing back orifice was not illegal. Using back orifice for illegal things would certainly be illegal. We were not contacted by law enforcement at all post release of BO or BO2K. I did, however, before releasing back orifice, try to get a hold of somebody at the FBI cybersecurity division, which turned out to be located here in San Francisco. So it took me a while to get somebody on the phone. I explained to him what I had written and that I planned to release it publicly at DEF CON. He listened, and all he said was, "We wish you would not do this, but there is no reason you can't." So I essentially called law enforcement myself and asked them if I was going to get into trouble by doing this. And they said that I was not crossing any lines that they cared about, or, well, I guess they cared about it, but not that was prosecutable. When we first released Back Orifice, there was somebody who was on a campaign to attempt to prevent our distribution of it by directly contacting the highest people they could get a hold of at whatever ISP we were using to distribute it. So the ISP that was hosting cultdeadcow.com, where we were distributing it, they, without warning, removed our site. And I don't even remember what explanation they gave at the time. So we rehosted several times with other providers, and the same thing kept happening. So there was definitely somebody of power who was threatening not us directly, but our service providers. It ended up being hosted at a friend of the herd was going to school at University of Georgia, or Georgia Tech, I guess, out of his dorm room, where they had really good internet connections directly to their dorm room with no firewall. So he started hosting our site, and presumably the same actors contacted the dean and attempted to get him punished and maybe kicked out of school for doing this. And as I understand it, the dean did not comply, and that is why Back Orifice was largely distributed out of a dorm room at Georgia Tech. Microsoft's public response to Back Orifice was that this was a non-issue, and to their point, it didn't exploit any specific vulnerability. There was no bug for them to fix. But Windows 95 was designed with almost no security built into it. Windows 95 had a login screen at startup, but you could actually just hit escape and it would still let you into the operating system. It just wouldn't let you join the other, wouldn't let you connect to other Windows machines across the network. Windows NT's model, had a separation between administrator and user level access, which Windows 95 did not have at all. Um, this is probably because at the time computers were still new to people and they were trying to market to the largest audience ever, and things like user access permissions are simply beyond most people. So they wanted something out of the box that would work for, they were marketing it to grandmothers and 12-year-olds and saying, oh, this gets you on the internet, this, you can do your online shopping and your banking and all this using this operating system that we designed with essentially no security built into it. There was also no public education about the basics of computer security. The way that I believe most people were infected with Back Orifice is somebody sent them an executable either via email or IRC or AO. I think you could send files over AOL back then, and said, "Hey, check out this cool thing," and then they would run the executable, and that was the Back Orifice server, which was self-installing. If it saw that it wasn't running from the System32 directory with the name it was configured to, it would put itself there, and then it would execute itself and delete the original executable that was used to install it. So you would be sent an executable, convinced to run it, double click on it, and the icon would simply disappear. And you would say, oh, it didn't work. And then the person would say, oh, sorry, I guess there's something wrong, or it doesn't work on your computer, but they are now infected with Back Orifice. So another tool that I wrote and released under the Cult of the Dead Cow label was called SMB Relay. again, this was me writing my own handler for the NetBIOS over TCP protocol on TCP port 137. And I figured out how to do that by reading RFC 1000 and 1001, which had the protocol explanation and breakdown of where all the bytes go. It's SMB, which is the protocol underneath that, is a very, very ugly protocol. So it doesn't surprise me that nobody had really done this before. But in reading that, in reading the RFCs, it occurred to me that it should be very simple to man in the middle an SMB connection back to the computer it originated from, because Windows, being the very friendly computer that it does, will by default try to log in as the currently logged in user. Back in the day, browsers would do this, and an attack vector was file colon slash slash. The SMB relay attack worked. A form of it was later incorporated into Metasploit. And I didn't really think too much more of it for years until 9 years later, Microsoft, in one of their security updates, marked the issue as being fixed. And somebody noticed that the date on the vulnerability and said, this has been possible for 9 years. And it's not surprising because it's not a bug, it's a design flaw. And to break away from that design, you're going to break connectivity with all the computers that are running the previous version of the protocol that don't have the changes implemented. I talked to several people at Microsoft Security who thanked me for releasing that tool, because it was something that they were well aware of, but they were never given the resources or permission to fix the issue because it wasn't being publicly exploited, because there was no known attack for it. And by releasing a tool that demonstrates, hey, this is how simple this can work, it at least forced the higher ups to acknowledge it and eventually address it. Although it is shocking, it took 9 years later. I started reading people talking about it, and people were like, "Oh yeah, in my security class, I use that tool, and nobody ever thinks it's going to work." And then they're shocked when it works, and their computer has been that easily taken over.